So I've recently been rereading all of my favorite Mariana Zapata books, and every time I post that I finished another one on my Instagram, I get a bunch of DMs of just discussing with people which ones are our favorite, which ones we like more than others. And I've said this multiple times on my channel that even though I absolutely love 8 of her books out of the 13 that she's written, I have a very hard time distinguishing which one I like more than others. So I thought it would be a little bit interesting today to try to be a little bit more critical than I usually am when it comes to her books and try to choose a little bit more clearly which ones I like over others. So that's why we're going to be tier ranking them today. So if you've been to one of my tier ranking videos before, then you know that I absolutely hate coming up with tier ranking names, and I'm also pretty bad at it. So like always, we're going with the basics, which are pretty self-explanatory, and I've got 5 tiers that we're working off of. So I have didn't even finish, which obviously means that I did not even finish the book because that's how much I wasn't enjoying it. Then I have did not enjoy, which means that I did finish the book, but I didn't really enjoy my time with it. Then I have not my favorite, which it wasn't as bad as like I had a horrible time with it, but also I wouldn't per se ever reread it. Then I have my favorites, which obviously are my favorites of hers. And then I have the best of the best, which they definitely are my favorites, but I think I like them slightly more than my other favorites, you know? So with that said, let's get into tier ranking. So first up, we have Lingus. So this is actually the first book that she's ever written, and it was one of the last ones that I ever read because I wasn't per se super interested in the storyline. So if you're not familiar with it, it's when you're the one where you're following the porn star. This girl goes to a porn convention with her friend, ends up meeting a porn star, and then they end up becoming friends and obviously will slowly fall for each other. So I knew going into this one that it wasn't going to be my favorite, but I ended up reading it anyway just because I wanted to be able to say that I've read every single one of her books. And honestly, it wasn't as bad as I expected it to be, especially because it was the first book that she's ever written. But at the end of the day, I wasn't really into the general storyline. I don't have anything super against it, but I didn't absolutely love it. And I think one of the biggest reasons for that is because I'm not a huge friends to lovers fan, and I'm almost positive this did work out and like they started as friends and then he slowly just like fell for her and decided that he wanted to like, you know, be in a relationship with her or something like that. Don't take my word for that because I don't super remember the details. But either way, I just remember not absolutely loving it. But honestly, I don't think that I really hated my time with it. So I think that I'm gonna put it on not my favorite. So anyway, after that, we've got Underlock. So this one I definitely do love, and I do put it in my like reread rotation every time I'm down to reread her books. I absolutely love Dex, but my one issue with this book is that I'm not the biggest fan of Iris per se. Like, I don't absolutely hate her, but I do think that she's a little bit childish, especially in comparison to Mariana Zapata's other female main characters. And also throughout this book, I didn't absolutely love some of the moves that she made. Like at certain points, I'm like, why did you do that? That was so stupid. Like, you did not have to put yourself in those situations. So I'm gonna say that it is my favorite because I still very much enjoy my time while reading it. But if I'm being very critical and I had to compare it to my other favorites, this is definitely not the best of the best. So next up we have Culti, and even though I know that I absolutely love this one, I'm trying to be very critical here and try to differentiate which ones I feel like are more perfect than others. And if I had to critique this one in any way, I feel like my one complaint would be that I wish I got a little bit more from Culti specifically. Like the fact that he has an ex-wife as well as the whole like DUI situation, I feel like we never really talked about it very much. Like the two main characters never really had a full-on conversation about it. And it made sense in the story because at the end of the day, it's like she really, you know, respected him and his boundaries, and like she never really pushed him too much because she was the same way, so she understood him. And I think that's a reason why they very much got along and like everything along those lines. But I always feel like when I finish the book, I'm like, but what about that one conversation? Like, could we talk about it for half a second maybe? And it doesn't really truly bother me because at the end of the day, all of Mariana Zapata's men hardly talk, and we don't really get too many conversations like that, like deep dive conversations between the two of them. But sometimes we do, like in her other books, sometimes like we do get some of those conversations, and I do wish that we possibly would have gotten a conversation about those two topics in this book. And because we didn't, for now, I do think that I'm going to put it on just my favorite, but it is very close to being the best of the best. And maybe at the end, I'll swap it around once I see what ended up on what tier. So either way, yeah, that's Culti. Next is Rhythm, Chord, and Malakin, and I was actually having a very hard time remembering the specific details on why I actually DNF'd this book. So firstly, we're gonna put it on Didn't Even Finish, but I did wanna share with you why I didn't even finish it, except I couldn't remember off the top of my head. So I went back to Goodreads and looked up my review, so we're going to reread it together. So what did I say? I tried really hard to not DNF this, but I couldn't do it. I'm all for a girl being one of the guys, but this was just way too much for me. Mentions of sweating like crazy and stinking like a man, pit stains on her shirt, fungus on her feet, taking a shit in a plastic bag, vomiting on stage, and the random underhand comments that she's fat were just not working for me. But I really had to stop reading when the guy shaved off 1/3 of her head after basically breaking her face with a soccer ball while playing a game she didn't even want to play. Plus, Sasha had a girlfriend at least for the first 1/3 of the book I read, and I really didn't care to see how that worked itself out. I felt zero connection to anything. I didn't like the characters. I was bored by the story, and I only regret not listening to my gut when I was telling me this book wasn't going to work for me in the first chapter. I can't believe I'm DNFing an MZ book, but whatever. I'll pretend I never read this one because I didn't want to knock her off my favorite author list. So yeah, I feel like once I finished this review and everything like that, I just blacked this book out of my mind, and that's why I couldn't even remember what it was about. But the second I reread that, I'm like, oh yeah, I just remember being super weirded out by it. So I still do not regret my decision of DNFing one of her books, even though she still is one of my favorite authors of all time. Next up is The Wall of Winnipeg and Me, and what's funny is that when I look at all of her books, I don't per se think that The Wall of Winnipeg and Me is my #1 favorite read of hers, but when I was sitting down before I started this video trying to think of something that I potentially could complain about for this book, I literally came up with nothing. So the only place that it deserves to be is the best of the best. I don't know if it's per se my #1 read from her. We'll decide that at the end of this video, but I don't really have anything whatsoever to complain about this book that I could think of off the top of my head. So it definitely is one of my all-time favorites of hers. So with that said, next up is Wait For It. And my only complaint for this one is that I do remember the first time that I did read this book. I've now read it 4 times, but the first time that I read it, I remember it having a much slower start than her other books, which all have slower starts, but I thought that this was a little bit slower in general, specifically getting Dallas and then Diana to start interacting with each other. So I do remember the first time that I read it, I had a bit of a hard time with it. But every time that I reread it now, I honestly don't even notice that. The slow start of it really does not bother me, and I think that's mostly because I am just such a big fan of Diana and then her 2 little kids in general. So I just have a great time hanging out with them, and it doesn't really make a difference to me that Dallas doesn't really start showing up until a little bit later into the book. So I definitely still think that this is one of the best books by her. And honestly, if I just had to look at both of them, The Wall of Winnipeg and Me and Wait For It, even though I have that tiny little complaint about Wait For It, the first time that I read it, even though it's not a complaint for all of my rereads, I feel like I still enjoyed a little bit more than The Wall of Winnipeg and Me. And I can't really explain why. Maybe it's this single parent thing going on, but for some reason, I feel like I like Wait For It just a little bit more than The Wall of Winnipeg, but I still absolutely love both. We're just trying to be really picky here. So anyway, with that said, next up is Dear Aaron. And the funny thing is that I know that a lot of people really are not huge fans of this book specifically, and I think it's because of the weird way that it's laid out, because it the first half of the book is all letters, emails, and then correspondence between the 2 main people, and then the second half of the book jumps into real life, where we start to get a little bit of extra monologue and dialogue and stuff along those lines. But I personally am a huge fan of when 2 characters initially meet online and then start having getting to know each other kind of thing through emails and stuff along those lines. It's something that I have a thing for, and therefore this book really works for me. So it definitely is one of my all-time favorites of hers, and I really do very much enjoy rereading it. But my only complaint for it is that I do feel like it ends slightly abruptly. All of her books do end abruptly, but I feel like this one is a little bit quick in comparison to others. So for now, I'm gonna put this on my favorites, even though I have a really big thing for it, and I am a really big fan of it. I don't know, I feel like that complaint is a very good complaint, because I really wish we maybe just got 1 extra chapter, you know? All right, so next is From Luca with Love. And what's funny is that I remember the first time that I read it, it was one of the earlier books that I read out of her. Maybe it was like, I don't know, my third, fourth, maybe fifth book by her. I don't even think so, probably like third or fourth. I remember thinking like, okay, this is my number one favorite. I had already read All Roads Lead Here. I had read The Wall of Winnipeg. I had read Culti. And I think this was the next one that I had read after all of those. And I'm like, oh my God, I loved this book. Probably gonna be my number one. But the funniest thing is that now when I do all of my rereads, like I said, I'm on my fourth round of rereading all of her books. This is not the one that I jump to, and I can't really pinpoint as to why, because when I'm literally reading it, I have an amazing time with it, and I absolutely love it, and I die for it just as much as her other books, but also, it's not one that I like jump to pick up first thing. Like, I always jump to some of the other books first, and therefore, I'm a little bit iffy about putting this one on the best of the best, even though I feel like it is the best of the best. Like, by the time I get to the end of the book, I'm like, holy crap, this was such a good time. But I feel like I just have a hard time starting it. And I think the reason for that is because I do think that it does have a bit of a slower start than her other books. Just like how Wait For It had a bit of an extra slow start, I do think that this one had the same type of slow start as well. And I feel like that's probably a reason why I'm always hesitant a little bit to start it. But I always have a great time once I'm into it. So for now, I'm gonna put it on my favorite. But, maybe I'll switch it to the best of the best at the end. We'll see how many books end up on the top tier. So, Luna and the Lie. The funny thing about this book is I very specifically remember the first time that I ever read this book, I did have a couple of complaints of it. And I was like, oh, you know what? I really, really loved it. I would definitely reread it, but I don't think it's like my favorite out of all of her books. But then when I go to do all of my rereads, this is honestly one of the first ones that I usually go to. And I think that it has slowly become one of my favorites. So I do remember the first time that I read it, my initial complaint about it was that Luna was way, way, way too nice. I am all for Grumpy Sunshines, and I do think that they are the literal epitome of a Grumpy Sunshine because he is so freaking grumpy, and she is like the most sunshiny character I've ever read in my entire life. But I think that was a downfall for her in the sense of like, she's so freaking nice that she ends up being a pushover. And I do remember that the first time that I read this book, that was something that definitely did bother me. But then when I go into my rereads, for some reason, I'm not bothered by it anymore, even though I do notice a little bit. And I think that's just because I'm just such a really, I'm a huge fan of the entire book in general. I love the storyline. I love both of the characters. I think they're so good together. I love everything that happens in this book. Like all of the scenes, I really, really, really love it. The ending with all of the groveling, one of my favorite endings from Mariana Zapata. And that's why even though the first time that I read it, I didn't really feel like it was going to be one of my all-time favorites of her. Now that I do reread it, I do feel like it is one of the best by her. And I don't know which one I like out of all three of those, so we're just gonna leave them in the order that they are currently in of all of the best, even though I already had switched around Wait For It and The Wall of Winnipeg. But we're just gonna leave it like that for now, and we're gonna move on. So next up is The Best Thing. And I had only read this book because I wanted to be able to say that I have read every single one of her books, but I knew going into it that it probably wasn't gonna work out for me because I knew what the book was about, and those stuff generally don't work for me. So if you're not familiar, it is a second chance romance, as well as slight spoiler warning, even though this is what the entire book's about, so it's kind of stupid that it's not more well known about this fact, but spoiler warning, it's a secret baby trope, which I'm very much not a fan of. So spoiler warning done. I very much didn't end up enjoying it, mostly because that is what the general book was about, and I don't really like reading those storylines. First of all, I'm not a fan of second chance romances, and if you're going to convince me on a second chance romance, you have to give me a very, very, very good reason as to why these two people took a bit of a break for, however long they did. And I didn't really think that the reason they did take a break was a very good reason, so I wasn't sold on the second chance trope. I didn't really like how the entire other trope went down that was a spoiler warning that we won't talk about now in case people didn't want to hear the spoiler warnings. And then on top of that, I also felt like the entire book was extremely boring. Like everything that happened in the book was super mundane. It just involved the, spoilery trope of sorts, and I feel like everything they did just wasn't very fun to like read about, and I was just bored the entire time. So all around the board, this book very much did not work for me, and I just think that I wasn't really per se the right reader for it, so I'm not gonna hold anything against it, but I definitely did not enjoy it. So with that said, next is Hands Down, and what's funny is that I was very hesitant to pick this one up because I had seen a lot of really good reviews about it, but then I also equally saw some reviews of like, this just was not her best work, but I gave it a shot anyway because like I said, I wanted to read every single one of her books, and I'm honestly not super upset that I read it, but I never would reread it. So the thing is that this is one of those like, what is it? Like they were best friends at one point and then they kind of like split up for a long time and then they came back together. So it's not per se a second chance because they weren't initially in a relationship, but they had a past of sorts. And what I did like about this book is that for two people who did have a past and then had to like reconcile and like fix their relationship of sorts and then move on and, you know, have a relationship from that, I do think that it was done very well. Usually, well, not usually, but often a thing that I do have an issue with second chances is the fact that sometimes it's too heavily based in the past. Like all of their feelings for each other are from their past time. And then all of a sudden they get their second chance and they just like fall back into how they were years ago. But in this book specifically, I do think that even though it really started because of their past, they had a very strong past that we got to know very well, I do think that it was also built up very well in the present day. So even though it did have a very second chances sort of feeling, I didn't not like the book because of that. But I don't think that I really liked it because I didn't really feel the romantic connection between the two of them. I honestly think that the two people in this book would have been much better as best friends, and therefore once we got to the end of it and all of a sudden the romance part of it started kicking in, I honestly felt a little bit weird about it. Like it really made me cringe. I just felt off. I wasn't really feeling it, and therefore I didn't really like how it ended, even though I kind of did enjoy my time getting to the end. So it had a very like underwhelming ending for me, didn't really like the end, and therefore I wouldn't really want to put myself through all of that to not get an amazing ending, because why I like Mariana Zapata books is because they just build up and up and up and up, and by the time I get to the end, I'm like, oh my god, I need more. But this one specifically, I was like, okay, maybe we should have stopped a little bit early, and therefore I'm going to say that it was not my favorite. I didn't hate it enough to say that I didn't enjoy it, but I definitely don't think I will ever decide to revisit it. So next is All Roads Lead Here, and this was actually the first book that I had ever read by her, and I remember that the first time that I read it, I had a very hard time with the slow burn. It was one of the first really slow burn romances that I ever read, and I was like, look, I'm a fan of this. I'm down to read more of it, but I don't know if like I absolutely loved it. Even though I gave it 5 stars at the time, I'm like, this was amazing, and I could read this like on and on, but I remember having a hard time getting into it initially, and therefore when I started reading more and more of her books, I was like, you know what, I like this one more than the previous one, and then the next one I was like, oh my god, I like this one more than the previous one, and it really took me a couple of rereads to really start to pinpoint which one I like more than others. But the thing is that once I started rereading All Roads Lead Here a couple of times, I realized that I wanted to take back my initial feelings towards the book, because I realized that I just wasn't per se prepared for the slow burnness of it. But I slowly started falling in love with how she writes her books, and that's when I realized that All Roads Lead Here might actually be one of my all-time favorites of hers, like literally the top of the top of the top, like my number one. And that is mostly because not only do I not have any complaints about it, but I also have a couple of things that I love a little bit extra about it versus her other books. And that is that I love how even though it definitely has a slow burn, and I feel like the romantic tensiony parts don't really start to come together until maybe like halfway in the book, we still do get a lot of initial interactions between the two of them, even though they're far and few between. So I really like that we jump right into seeing them interact versus something like Wait for It, or you know what other one, or like Luca with Love had a very slow start where it really took a minute to get to see the two main characters even talk to each other. So that was a thumbs up to it. And then on top of that, I also feel like it is the opposite of ending abruptly, how most of her books very much do. Like most of her books, we literally like get our happily after and then it's over. Like we don't even get an extra minute with seeing them together. Like we'll get the epilogue, but besides the epilogue, we really don't get to see much. But specifically in All Roads Lead Here, I feel like we do get half a minute with them together, and I really absolutely love that half a minute. I feel like it's exactly what all of her books really need. Just that little extra moment where we get to see them happy together and like all is good. So I'm going to definitely put this on the best of the best, but I'm putting this on my number one best of the best. So yeah, at least we found which one is my number one from Mariana Zapata. And with that said, we only have one more book to go through, which is her newest release, which is When Gracie Met the Grumps. So unfortunately, this is the second book that I did end up DNFing from Mariana Zapata. I don't remember how far I got into it, but I did give it at least a couple of 100 pages. Maybe I even got like close to 40% in. I honestly don't remember, but I just did not enjoy my time with this. I honestly thought that it was an interesting idea and could have been a really fun novella or short story, but it was a bit of an odd storyline for a full-length novel, and it was way too too dragged out to the point where it made it difficult for me to not skim every single page. Like, I just remember when I got into it, I was really trying and trying and trying, but there was just something about it that really was making me not connect to it. And I just didn't want to put myself through any more of it, so I eventually gave up on it. So yeah, that is me tier ranking every single book by Mariana Zapata. Honestly, this was slightly harder than I expected it to be, but also not too hard. So let's quickly just go over what are my top 2 tiers, because I want to see if I like made a bit of a mistake here. So I definitely do think that Under Lock deserves to be on my favorites. Culti maybe could be on the best of the best, but honestly, I feel like the top 4 I do like more than Culti, so maybe we'll just leave it there. Dear Aaron, I think is in the right spot, and From Luca with Love, I'm still contemplating going on the best of the best. Like, maybe I can do Culti and From Luca with Love on the best of the best, but we're trying to be really like picky here, so I feel like it was fine where it was. So yeah, I like my 2 top tiers, and the rest definitely feel like they are in the correct order. Maybe, if anything, I can bring like Lingus down to did not enjoy, because I didn't really enjoy it, and I definitely enjoyed hands down more than Lingus and The Best Thing. So I feel like honestly that looks a little bit more correct than I initially had it. So I think we're going to leave it exactly like that, and that means that we're done with today's video. So thank you so much for coming along with me while I tier ranked all of Mariana Zapata's books. I'm so interested to hear which are your favorite books of hers, maybe which are your least favorite. Have you read all of them? Do you still have some that you're planning on reading? Let me know down in the comment section below. But either way, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video, because I really, really, really appreciate it. And with that said, until next time, enjoy reading.